The smell of old motor oil and oxidized steel hung over Kellner Street the way weather hangs over a valley. Not unpleasant, just permanent. The kind of smell that tells you something real has been happening in a place for a long time. The building itself was low and wide, its corrugated walls gone the color of old pennies, a hand-lettered sign above the roll-up door, reading Decker Restorations in paint that had faded to the color of a bruise. Out front, beside a cracked concrete apron, sat the object in question, a 1967 Lamborghini 400 GT, stripped to bare metal, its body panels stacked against the wall like discarded playing cards, its engine cavity open to the October air like a wound that had not yet been addressed. Diane Ashworth, CEO of Ashworth Prestige Imports, stepped out of a black Cayenne that morning wearing a charcoal wool coat, and the expression of someone who had already made up her mind before arriving. She looked at the car for perhaps 4 seconds. Then she said, loud enough for her assistant, Marcus, to hear clearly, "This is what he called a project. It looks like a salvage lot that gave up." She did not know that the man inside the building, wiping his hands on a gray shop cloth and watching through the gap in the door, had spent 11 years as the lead restoration specialist at Herpertone's private conservation facility outside Turin. She did not know that 3 of the cars he had rebuilt there now held authenticated certificates from the Registro Italiano Veicoli Storici, or that one of them had sold at Bunham's Geneva for 4.2 million euros. She did not know that his name appeared in the acknowledgments of 2 peer-reviewed monographs on Italian coach-built vehicles, credited simply as technical consultant, because he had never sought more than that. She knew only what she could see from a parking lot, and she had decided that was enough. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. His name was Owen Decker. He was 38 years old, and he had chosen this building on Kellner Street deliberately, the way a man chooses a thing that will not lie to him. The shop had belonged to a retired machinist named Horace Finch, who had run it as a general auto repair for 30 years before his knees gave out, and he sold the list for less than it's worth of, to a man he liked the look of. Owen had paid cash. He did not advertise. He did not have a website. He charged fairly, and he worked slowly, and he was booked 14 months out by word of mouth alone, which was the only kind of word that had ever meant anything to him. He had come back from Turin in the spring of 4 years ago. Claire had been gone 8 months by then. A cerebral aneurysm, sudden and without warning, on a Tuesday morning in February while she was making coffee. She was 34. Their daughter, Nora, was 6. Owen had been in Italy when it happened, and the flight home had taken 11 hours, and he had spent most of those hours understanding that the life he had been building in one direction would now have to be built in another. He did not dramatize this. He simply recalculated. Nora carried a small stuffed rabbit she called Pip everywhere she went. The rabbit had been Claire's idea, a gift for Nora's 3rd birthday, white once, now the color of old ivory from 3 years of being held. Nora brought Pip to the shop on afternoons when school let out early, setting the rabbit on the corner of Owen's workbench with the careful placement of someone arranging something important. And then she would sit on a stool and watch her father work and ask questions that were serious and literal. and occasionally stopped Owen mid-motion because of how precisely they landed. The 400 GT had come to him through a collector in Zurich named Horst Meyer, who had acquired it from an estate sale and recognized immediately that he was not qualified to touch it. Horst had found Owen's name through a former client in Milan. He had shipped the car to Kellner Street with a single instruction: do it right. Owen had accepted the commission, quoted a timeline of 6 months, and begun the intake assessment on a Monday in September, logging every finding in a bound notebook with a mechanical pencil, the way he had been taught to do in Turin by a man named Salvatore Greco, who believed that documentation was the first act of restoration. The car's condition was complicated, not catastrophic, but layered, the kind of complexity that rewards patience and punishes shortcuts. The original Bizzarini V12 was present, but had been partially disassembled by a previous owner who had not finished what he started, leaving several components in a state of arrested incompletion that required Owen to reverse engineer the prior work before he could properly assess the baseline. He spent 2 full days on that reversal alone, photographing each component's position before disturbing it, sketching clearances in the notebook margin with a precision that was habitual rather than deliberate, the way a musician marks tempo without thinking. The bodywork carried 2 respray campaigns over the original Verde Scuro, both of them amateur, both applied without proper surface preparation, so that the paint sat in uneven strata above the metal like geological sediment, each layer telling a story of someone who had wanted the car to look better without wanting to understand why it didn't. Owen noted all of this without judgment. The car was what it was. His job was to find out what it had been. Deanne Ashworth's interest in the car was not personal. It was strategic. Her firm, Ashworth Prestige Imports, had recently expanded into brokered classic vehicle sales, and one of her senior associates had identified the Meyer 400 GT as a potential centerpiece for a spring catalog, assuming it could be properly restored and authenticated. She had come to Kellner Street to assess the operation firsthand, which was how she described it to Marcus, and also to apply what she privately considered appropriate pressure on the timeline. She walked through the shop door without knocking. Owen was at the engine stand, torque wrench in hand, and he set it down and turned and waited. She introduced herself with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to rooms reorganizing around her arrival. She said she represented the buyer's interests in the project and wanted a progress update. Owen said the car was on schedule. She looked around the shop, at the pegboard walls hung with tools arranged by size and function, at the steel shelving units holding labeled bins of hardware sorted by thread pitch and material, at the work light clamped above the engine stand, casting a clean white circle on the V12's exposed cam covers. And something in her expression shifted, though not toward approval. "I've seen more sophisticated setups in residential garages," she said. Marcus, standing near the door, did not write that down. He looked at the pegboard instead, at the way the tools were arranged by hand and by habit, at the labeled bins organized with a consistency that was not performative, but simply the natural order of a workspace that had been used the same way for a long time. He thought something he did not say aloud. Owen said nothing. His face was still. His hands were still. She asked about the respray. He said he was still in the strip phase. She asked when he expected to begin the paintwork. He said he would begin when the surface was ready. She asked what that meant, specifically. He told her, in plain, technical language, about the strat analysis he had performed using a Defelsco posy test gauge, and about the three areas of the left quarter panel where the base metal showed micropitting that would need to be addressed before any primer was applied, and about the fact that rushing that process would produce a result that looked correct in a photograph and failed in person within 18 months. He said all of this without raising his voice or adjusting his register. It was information. He was delivering it. Diane listened with the expression of someone waiting for a translation. Then she said she needed the car ready for the spring catalog, which meant a completed restoration by the 15th of March. Owen said he would have it done by the 10th. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I'll believe that when I see it." Then she left. Marcus paused at the door on the way out. He looked back at the engine stand, at the 400 GT's V12 sitting in the worklight circle, at the labeled bins and the bound notebook open on the steel shelf. He had been Diane's assistant for 3 years. He had been in a lot of shops. He did not say anything. He simply looked, the way a person looks when they are filing something away for later. The shop on Kellner Street was quiet after they left. Owen picked up the torque wrench. He went back to work. The days that followed had a rhythm that was easy to misread from the outside. Nothing about the work was fast. Nothing about it was meant to be. On day 3, Owen completed the full strip of the exterior panels, taking each one down to bare metal with a combination of chemical stripper and a pneumatic needle scaler set to the minimum effective pressure because the 400 GT's body panels were hand-formed aluminum, and aluminum does not forgive aggression. He photographed each panel at 3 stages: pre-streep, mid-streep, post-streep, and logged the findings in the notebook. The left quarter panel showed the micro-pitting he had anticipated, plus a small area of previous weld repair near the lower trailing edge that had been finished with body filler and painted over. He measured the repair with calipers, recording the dimensions twice to confirm consistency, then traced the weld seam with a fingertip and held the panel at a low angle under the work light until the shadow revealed the full extent of the distortion beneath. He noted the dimensions. He moved on. On day 7, he addressed the micro-pitting directly, working the affected area with a tungsten-tipped scribe and a magnifying loupe, mapping each pit's diameter and depth before selecting the appropriate filler compound. Not a commercial body product, but a 2-part epoxy primer formulated for bare aluminum, the same product specification he had used at the Bertoni facility on a 1963 Giulia Sprint that now lived in a private collection in Lugano. The work was slow. It was meant to be slow. He spent 4 hours on a surface area smaller than his open hand, and when he was finished, the quarter panel was flat and true and ready for what came next. Nora came to the shop on a Thursday afternoon in the second week, setting Pip on the corner of the workbench with the usual care and climbing onto her stool. She watched Owen work for a while in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over 4 years of afternoons like this one. Then she said, "Is the car sick?" Owen looked up. He said it had been sick for a while, but it was getting better. Nora considered this. She looked at the bare aluminum panels leaning against the wall, at the engine stand, at the open notebook. "Pip got sick once," she said. "His ear came off. You sewed it back." She picked up the rabbit and examined the ear in question, which was indeed slightly different in color from the rest of the rabbit. A repair made 4 months after Claire died, using a needle and thread from a kit Owen had found in the kitchen drawer. "You made it so you could barely tell," Nora said. This was not a compliment, exactly. It was an observation. The distinction mattered to her. Owen said, "That's the idea." On day 14, Luca Ferrante arrived from Bridgeport with his own tools and a thermos of coffee, and they began the valve train geometry work on the Bizzarini V12 together. Luca was a short man with wide hands and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have been doing precise work in confined spaces for 20 years. He and Owen had met at the Bertone facility in Turin, where Luca had been a visiting specialist for 6 months on a Ferrari driveline project, and they had developed the kind of working relationship that does not require much speech. Luca would take a measurement, Owen would log it, and the conversation between them was conducted mostly in the language of torque values and clearance tolerances, which was a language both of them trusted more than most others. They worked side by side for 9 days. The shop smelled of cutting fluid and warm metal during those hours, a dense and specific smell that settled into clothing and did not leave easily, the kind of smell that accumulates only when the same careful work has been performed in the same careful way over a long stretch of time. On day 22, with the engine complete and back on the stand under the work light, Luca put his hand flat on the cam cover and held it there for a moment. The metal was cold. The gesture was not about temperature, he said. "Greco would approve," he said it quietly. He did not elaborate. He packed his tools the following morning and drove back to Bridgeport without discussing a fee. On day 26, Owen received the spectrophotometric profile from Dr. Friederike Baum in Stuttgart. He had sent her the paint sample from the inner door jamb on day 6. A careful scraping taken with a scalpel at the point where the original factory finish had been protected from all subsequent resprays by the door seal, the kind of sample that preserves color data, the way amber preserves an insect unchanged and complete. Dr. Baum had worked with the Deutsches Technikmuseum on period-correct automotive pigment analysis for 14 years, and her report ran to 8 pages, including the full spectrophotometric curve, and a written notation that the original Verde Scuro on this chassis was a factory mixed variant, slightly cooler, in the green register than the standard code, consistent with a documented production anomaly in the third quarter of 1967. Owen read the report twice. Then he mixed the paint from the profile, checking the result against the jam sample under daylight, tungsten, and fluorescent light sources in sequence until the match was exact. Not approximate, exact. He applied the first coat to a test panel and set it under the daylight lamp for 40 minutes, watching the color settle as the solvents released, comparing the dried surface to the jam sample at 3 angles before he was satisfied. Then he mixed the second batch and began on the car itself. The 10th of March arrived the way Owen had said it would. Not as a surprise, not as a triumph, but as the natural consequence of work performed in the correct order over the correct amount of time. The shop on Kellner Street smelled that morning of fresh lacquer and the faint mineral sharpness of polished aluminum, a smell that was different from the smell of the shop in September, cleaner and more particular, the kind of smell that accumulates only when something has been brought back to what it originally was. The 400 GT stood in the center of the floor, under 3 work lights arranged at the angles Salvatore Greco had taught Owen to use for final inspection, 45 degrees from each flank and one directly overhead, because Greco had believed that light was the last honest critic, and that a finish which could not survive all 3 angles had not been finished. The documentation was complete. The bound notebook ran to 211 pages of logged findings, measurements, and photographic records. Owen had submitted the full file to the Registro Italiano Veicoli Storici 8 days before the completion date, accompanied by the colorimetric analysis from Dr. Baum, the provenance chain from the Meyer estate, and a separate structural assessment prepared by an independent inspector Owen had engaged, a retired engineer from the Politecnico di Milano named Carlo Vettori, who had been examining Italian coach-built vehicles for 40 years and who had driven to Kellner Street on a Tuesday in February, spent 6 hours with the car, and written a 12-page report that concluded with the sentence: "The restoration demonstrates a standard of material fidelity and technical execution consistent with the highest tier of period-correct conservation. Work currently practiced in this field." The certificate arrived on the 7th of March. Owen read it once, set it on the shelf beside the notebook, and went back to work on the final polish. The unveiling was not Owen's event to organize. Horst Meyer had arranged a private viewing at a specialist gallery in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of room that handled objects of this category, climate-controlled, white walls, a floor that had been chosen to complement rather than compete. Horst had invited 12 people, all of them collectors or brokers of established reputation, and he had asked Owen to be present. Owen came in the truck. He wore a clean shirt. He stood near the back of the room. Diane Ashworth was there. She had come because the car was still the centerpiece of the spring catalog, and because Marcus had told her 3 days before the event that he had looked into Owen Decker's background and found something she should know. He had set a printed summary on her desk without comment. 2 pages, single-spaced, beginning with the Bertoni facility and ending with the Bun Ham's Geneva result. She had read it twice. She had not said anything to Marcus afterward. She had simply sat with it. The car arrived on a transport and was positioned under the gallery lights at 7 in the evening. When the covers came off, the room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected has happened. Not silent, but recalibrated, the ambient conversation dropping by half a register as people turned and looked and adjusted their understanding of what they were looking at. The Verde Scuro caught the gallery lighting at an angle that made the color appear to shift between deep forest and something closer to black, and 2 of the collectors moved toward it without appearing to decide to do so. Drawn by the finish, the way a person is drawn toward a sound they cannot immediately identify. Dr. Elaine Forsyth, Senior Authentication Specialist at the Registro's North American Liaison Office, was the first to speak in any formal capacity. She stood beside the car with the certificate in her hands and described in the measured professional language of her field what the document represented: a full authentication of chassis, drivetrain, and bodywork, a confirmed match to the original factory specification on all primary surfaces, and a provenance record that was, in her words, unusually complete. She said the colorimetric documentation alone was the most thorough she had reviewed on a vehicle of this period outside a museum context. She said the restoration had been performed to a standard that would support any major auction estimate. Then she named a figure. The room adjusted again. Owen heard the number from the back of the room. He registered it. He set it aside. Diane Ashworth stood 12 feet from the car and did not move for a long moment. Her expression was not the expression she had worn in the parking lot on Kellner Street. It was something quieter and more inward, the kind of expression that belongs to a person doing rapid and honest arithmetic. Marcus stood slightly behind her, as he always did, and he was watching the car with the look of someone who had already done that arithmetic and arrived at the answer some days ago. She crossed the room to Owen at 20 minutes past 7. She walked without hurry, which was itself a change from the way she had walked into his shop in October. She stopped in front of him and she said, "I said something at your shop when I first came. It was unkind." She did not dress it up. She did not add qualifications. "I had not done adequate research before I formed an opinion," she said. "That was a professional failure on my part." Owen said, "All right." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said she would like to discuss a formal arrangement, a consulting relationship for vehicles moving through Ashworth Prestige Imports that required restoration or authentication assessment. She named a retainer figure. It was a serious number. She said she understood he was booked out and that the terms could accommodate his existing commitments. Owen said he would think about it. She nodded once. She started to turn, then paused. "The Verde Scuro," she said. "I've seen that color on 3 other 400 GTs. It never looked like that." She said it as a statement of fact, not a compliment. The distinction was real, and she understood it was real, and that understanding was in her voice. Owen said, "The other 3 were probably mixed from a chip card." She looked at the car once more. Then she left. A man named Garrett Plum, one of Diane's senior associates, and the one who had laughed loudest in the parking lot in October when she made her remark about the salvage lot, stood near the bar at the far side of the room for the duration of the event. He had not approached the car when the covers came off. He had not approached it during Dr. Forsyth's remarks. He had stood with his glass and watched from a distance with the particular stillness of a person who has understood something they would prefer not to have understood. At 8:15, he set his glass down on a tray and walked out without speaking to anyone, and the door closed behind him with the quiet certainty of a thing that was simply finished. Owen drove back to Kellner Street at 9:30. He pulled the truck into the alley behind the shop and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the tick of the cooling metal. The alley smelled of cold concrete and the faint residual lacquer still drifting from the shop's ventilation. And he sat with that smell, the way a man sits with something familiar after a long day of unfamiliar things. Inside, he turned off the work lights one by one, leaving only the single overhead fluorescent above the bench, which threw a long rectangle of pale light across the empty floor where the 400 GT had stood that morning. The floor was clean. The tools were on the pegboard. The notebook was on the shelf. He drove home on streets that were quiet at that hour, the truck's headlights, finding the familiar turns without his having to think about them. The house was dark except for the kitchen window, which Nora always left lit when she was staying with Owen's neighbor, Mrs. Palermo, and which Owen had come to read as a kind of signal. Not a message, exactly, just a fact of the house that meant she was nearby and safe. He found Nora asleep on Mrs. Palermo's couch, Pip tucked under her chin, her breathing the slow and absolute breathing of a child who had exhausted herself completely and surrendered without reservation. He carried her home across the dark yard, her weight familiar and specific in his arms, and put her in her bed without waking her. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The kitchen window sent its light in a narrow band across the hallway floor. He looked at it. Then he went to bed. The things that have real value rarely announce themselves. They sit in strip bays and strip down shops, in the hands of people who learned their work from someone who learned it before them. In notebooks filled with measurements no one asked for, in the long, patient hours between what something is and what it was. Some people learn to see that. Most people learn too late or not at all. Owen Decker had simply kept working, the way a man works when the work is the point, quietly, correctly, completely. The kitchen window was still lit when the street outside went dark.